a bit quietly, right, with a little bit of reflection. I want you to kind of think a bit. You don't have to close your eyes, but if it helps, you're welcome to. I'd like you to think about the last time that you had this thought at work, right? Or maybe even said these words. But I'd like you to think about the last time that you said or thought, "I'm good." So maybe take a minute to just think about that. So maybe that was you wrote some snippet of code and you were really proud of it and you're like, wow, I'm really good. I'm good at my job. Maybe somebody suggested that you do a little bit more work than you wanted to do and you're like, nah, I'm good. I'm good. Maybe you lent a coworker some cash and you're like, I am a good person. Does anybody here have a memory? Raise your hand if you can think of a time. Okay, for those of you that have your hands raised, is anybody willing to share a quick story of what you're thinking about? Yeah, you want to go? That's right. Yeah, so for those of you that, if you can hear, kind of this fluctuation between like, I'm good, I suck, I'm good, I suck, right? It's kind of the process of coding, right? Anybody else want to share? All right, so this is my friend Mike Lebowitz. He's the CEO of an agency in Brooklyn called Big Spaceship. I was the design director there for a few years before I moved back to Philly and started SuperFriendly. And I'm really fortunate to have him as a boss and as a mentor. I just learned a lot from him. One of the things he's pretty fond of saying is this. He says, you spend a third of your life sleeping and a third of your life at work, so get a good mattress and find a job that you love. I have a great mattress. I sleep well. If you need recommendations, come and see me after the talk. As for the other part of this, I think that's what we're going to dive into a little bit right now. So according to a Gallup World Poll, 15% of the world's 1 billion full-time workers are engaged at work. That means 85% of us in the world are not engaged by what we do. And Gallup even goes so far as to say, we are in a worldwide employee engagement crisis. Right? People just don't enjoy their jobs. All right, we're going to talk about that for the next half an hour because I think it's important. Right, so you don't have to raise your hand or anything for this part, but I bet that statistic likely applies in this room too. 85% of you are probably unengaged at your jobs, and maybe you don't even know why. Now, maybe this room is a little bit skewed. You're all here, kind of volunteered to come here, or maybe we're sent here by your boss or your teammates to learn. Right, so maybe it's a little bit skewed here, but I think that statistic kind of reflects the world that we live in. What I'm going to do over the next half hour is just kind of share a couple of tips that I've found fruitful for me in my own practice and my own work, and we'll talk about things like accountability and motivation and collaboration. And what I'd like to do is give you some really actionable suggestions that you can take back to your work next week and implement right away with maybe yourself or your teams, whether you're a developer or an engineer, or maybe you manage developers or engineers. So kind of talking about both of those viewpoints. And then we'll carve out about 10 minutes or so of discussion at the end of this in case anybody has any questions. So feel free to think about some questions you might have related to these topics. And I know you're probably thinking, well, wait a minute, this is a WordPress conference. Where's all the WordPress content? So I just put it all in one slide. I figured if I just said functions.php, I would cover it, right? This will help you out on your bingo scorecards if you want. All right, so in 2013, there was a team in Google's people operations, that's what they call their HR, and they set out to determine what makes for effective teams at Google. Now, lead researcher Julia Rosowski reported her findings, and she said, we were pretty confident that we would find a really great mix of individual and traits and skills, and that's going to be what makes for good teams. If you just have the right people in the room, then that's what makes for good teams. And instead, they found that was totally wrong. Right? She says, who is on a team matters way less than how the team members interact, how they structure their work, and how they view their contributions. It wasn't about the actual people themselves. And of all the factors, there was one thing that emerged as the most important. Does anybody know what that is? Has anybody heard of this study before? Anybody know? Yeah. That's exactly right. The best teams had the best sense of psychological safety. Right? It wasn't about the people, it wasn't about their experience, it wasn't about their tenure, it wasn't about how long they were doing it, it's just about how safe they felt on their teams. Right? And at Google, what they found is that the teams that had the higher psychological safety are less likely to leave. Right? People are less likely to leave. They're more likely to harness the power of diverse ideas from teammates and colleagues. They bring in more revenue on average, and they're actually rated as effective twice as often by their executive teams. So what can you do right away to start creating more safety within your own teams? Right? So one tip here, one thing that you can try is perhaps you can encourage your teams to kick off meetings by sharing a risk that you've taken the previous week. Right? That's one way to kind of build the psychological safety, is to create this thing to say, this is an environment, this is a work culture where we embrace taking risks. Right? If you're not a manager, maybe you can't implement that on your own, but maybe you could talk to your manager about implementing something like this, and maybe you're willing to lead by example by just being the first to share whenever this comes up. All right, but wait, let's get back to reality for just a sec. Some of you listening are probably thinking like, yeah, that's a cool idea. We could try that at work. But I bet some of you were also thinking like, there's no way that would work for me and my teams. Like that's just not how we do work. That's not part of the way that we do work. It's the opposite of how we work right now. And that's totally fair. I think that's fair. For some of you, I bet taking risks is just not part of the culture of doing work. It's not part of your team's norms. Right? Your boss tells you what to do, your manager tells you what to do, and you just do it. Because there's likely some consequence waiting on the other end if you don't do it. So how do you turn that kind of situation into a healthy one? I think one of the places to start is you can establish really good boundaries. So talk about that for a minute. What does that mean? Here we've got an overhead map of Draper, Utah. My wife and I just flew in a couple days ago and rented an Airbnb out there. It was really serene and great. So let's say that these are one of these houses are yours, right? So this one here with kind of the white square, that's your house. Everything inside the walls counts as part of your house. That's probably not news to you. Everything outside of the walls, not your house. I'm not blowing any minds here, I don't think. It's a pretty simple definition, right? But your property extends just outside your house, too. It extends to your front yard and your backyard, right? The purple area, this is kind of your property. This delineates the boundaries of your property, and you get to decide who enters your property and who doesn't. Right? That's not, again, not blowing any minds here. Your friends and family can likely come in at your invitation. Strangers who threaten you probably cannot come in, and you might even ask for help escorting them off your property by the police or something like that. Right? So the same is true for you physically, mentally, and emotionally too. Right? You have boundaries that nobody should cross unless you allow them to. Sometimes it's easier to identify when people are crossing your boundaries, right? If somebody touches you in a way that you don't welcome, that's crossing your physical boundaries. Others are more difficult to identify though. Right? When your parent guilt trips you into visiting because you got to be a good son or a good daughter, that's crossing emotional boundaries. Right? Luckily, like building stronger fences or taller fences, we can all practice strengthening our boundaries too. And there are great resources that we have to help us do this. One of my favorites is this book. It's aptly titled Boundaries. It's by Dr. Henry Cloud and Dr. John Townsend. Has anybody here read this book? Highly recommend it. It's an excellent book. I got a lot out of it. In the book, there are great nuggets like, boundaries let the good in and keep the bad out. Right? That's a really simple definition. If you think about the boundaries of your house, that makes a lot of sense. But if you think about that physically, emotionally, and mentally, it makes sense too. Right? The book gives boundaries and defines boundaries. It gives examples of this in practice, right? Kind of an allegory style. And if you prefer a variation that's specific to your workplace, there's actually one that the same authors wrote called Boundaries for Leaders. And that has practical advice for managing teams, coaching direct reports, and really instilling an organization with strong values and strong culture. Right? So these are good resources. Another great resource is Counselor Nina Brown's Coping with Infuriating, Mean, Critical People. Kind of a funny title, but a great book. And in it, she suggests there's 4 types of boundaries. Right? So these are the types. The first type in the left there, or in the middle there, is some people have soft boundaries. What that means is their boundaries kind of merge a little bit with other people's boundaries. Right? They're easily victims of psychological manipulation. It's easy to talk them into things. Slightly higher than that, slightly stronger than that, is kind of spongy boundaries. So they're not exactly soft, but people with spongy boundaries are a bit unsure what to let in, what to keep out. Then all the way on the other side of the spectrum is rigid boundaries. Right? So people that are closed or walled off so that nobody can get close to them, either physically or emotionally. And usually people that have rigid boundaries, that comes from some sort of trauma. But what we all should strive for is this idea of flexible boundaries. And what that means is we decide what to let in and what to keep out. We're resistant to emotional contagion and psychological manipulation, and we're difficult to exploit. Right. I want to show you what that looks like in action. We're going to watch a little video here.
Yeah, for sure. Hey guys, don't forget, party this weekend, my place. Bring booze, chips, and most importantly, yourselves.
Cool.
Oh, I can't make it on Friday. I agreed to help a friend move, and I don't know what time we're gonna be done.
Yeah, I wish I could go too, but my dad's in town. I gotta show him around the old city. You know how dads are.
Dads love cities.
They do.
Sure.
Well, bummer. Well, what about you, Quinta?
Oh, I can't go either because I don't want to. Sorry.
I'm sorry. Do you have something to do?
No. I just don't want to go.
Is your dad in town and you have to take him around the city too?
Oh, no. My dad is living peacefully in Philadelphia. He hasn't visited in years. I just don't want to go.
You don't want to go because it's far away, because it's in Studio City, and that's a drive.
I actually live pretty close to Studio City in the Valley. Yeah. I just don't want to attend the party.
I'm sorry, Quinta. Is this something I did?
Oh my God, Justin, no. Where are you kidding me? You're a dear. You didn't do anything. I just would rather not and will not be attending your party.
Hold on. Is it because you have an improv class that night? That's what it is.
No, that's actually at 3:00 p.m. in the afternoon.
Oh, but that night you've got roller derby. That's why you can't go.
Thank you so much for remembering, Steve. Such a doll, but that actually got canceled this weekend.
Quinta, let me get this straight.
Yeah.
I'm having a party,
Yes.
and you are my friend,
I am.
and I invited you,
Thank you.
but
I am not going to that party.
What are you gonna do instead?
What is your reason for not going to his party?
Oh, the reason that I am not going to Justin's party is that I do not want to go to Justin's party.
hold on. Let's figure this out.
Okay.
I invited you
Yes.
to a party, which means Quinta goes, right?
Okay, let me show you the problem with your logic there. Let me get that math just a little off. So, see what you did here, but what you forgot was X, which is I don't want to go, which then changes the outcome to I am not going.
Wait, what?
Simple math.
I get it. Quinta here is trying to pull a fast one on us. She's saying that she's not gonna go. She's gonna show up halfway through the party and yell surprise. It's an opposite surprise party.
Ah, that's genius.
Okay.
That is a really fun way to think of it, you guys. If the surprise is that I will not be there because I'm not going.
Come on. I'm having a party, and I invited you, and you're just not gonna go because you don't want to go? At least these guys came up with valid excuses. Right, guys? Steve?
I wish I could be as honest as Quinta. I'm not going because I don't want to go.
I mean, my dad actually is in town and wants to go see the city, but I mean, if he wants to go to your party, then maybe.
Hello, son.
Oh, hey, sir. Would you be interested in coming to my party?
No, I don't want to go to your party.
It's a good video, right? It's a bit of a silly video. Quinta here had excellent flexible boundaries. She decides what to let in and what to keep out. She was resistant to psychological manipulation. She was difficult to exploit. Now, for those that learn and practice boundaries for the first time, there's often this one big objection. But isn't it rude, right? And let's be clear. It's not rude. Quinta was not being rude. It's not rude to say no to somebody. It's not rude to want something different than everybody else and to stand up for it. Quinta wasn't obnoxious or off-putting. She was pleasant and she was accommodating, but she still made sure that she was in control of what she wanted. That's what good boundaries look like. There's a complex concept in this boundaries book too, and the idea is that we are responsible to others and for ourselves, and the corollary is that we're not responsible for others. Right? The other two guys in the video, they were probably worried about hurting Justin's feelings, right? Probably well-intentioned, and that's where the complexity sneaks in. By making themselves responsible for Justin's feelings, by taking that on themselves, they're actually encroaching on Justin's boundaries, on his emotional ones, in making assumptions on behalf of his emotions. They're probably well-intentioned, but that really doesn't change the fact that it's still a boundary violation. The National Alliance on Mental Illness has some really great tips on maintaining relationships with somebody that have a mental illness. right? And what they say is this: tell your relative, if you have a relative that has a mental illness, tell your relative the standards that you need him to meet so you can live well together. Make sure your loved one knows that you see him as a whole person and that you expect him to follow these standards. So essentially, setting clear boundaries is an excellent way to maintain a healthy relationship with anyone, not just a person with mental illness. Right? Strong boundaries are really a prerequisite to creating accountability. We'll talk about that in just a minute. This is New Jersey Senator Cory Booker. When he was mayor of Newark, New Jersey, he helped realize unprecedented violent crime reduction and increase affordable housing in the city, all while reducing the city budget deficit. I was fortunate to hear him speak at Brooklyn Beta in 2012, and during the Q&A session, somebody asked him how he and his team are able to achieve the great results that they achieve, and we responded by saying, well, they really hold each other accountable, and proceeded to share his formula for accountability. And so this is the formula for accountability. I use this all the time. It's 3 quick steps, right? 3 parts to creating accountability. The first part is that all parties must agree to the same standard, right? You have to have a defined standard. So as an example, imagine you're talking to your manager and you might say something like, well, this functionality will be done by the end of today. Your manager, being a good manager, knows that you might need to be more specific in order to make sure you have a defined standard so that you can hold each other accountable. So instead of saying, this functionality, you say, okay, the ability to submit this form, right? What type of functionality? Maybe you could be more specific. And then instead of saying by the end of the day, what does end of the day mean? Is it midnight today? Is it close of business? What time zone? Okay, so now we've got a more specific set of standards. The ability to submit a form will be done by 5 p.m. Eastern today. Right? That's a standard that we can agree to. The next part of creating accountability is that you need a way to measure those standards, right? So the ability to submit a form will be done by 5 p.m. Eastern today. How can we measure this? Well, maybe your manager will check the staging server at 5:01 p.m. to test the functionality to see if it's there and to see if it's working, right? So easily testable. And the last piece of creating accountability is that there must be effects, either positive or negative or both, to see once those standards are measured. So here's a silly example. If the form submission works by 5:01, you get a promotion. But if it doesn't work, or worse, it's not even there, you get fired. Okay, so that's a pretty extreme and unlikely example, but maybe more realistically, maybe if that thing is there, your client is going to be really happy. Maybe if that functionality is not there, though, your client might not renew the account that you have, right? So positive and negative effects. Let's head back to these 3 parts. If your teams aren't being productive, there's a chance that it's because people aren't really being held accountable. Right? So if you think about a project that you might have worked on where you go, well, that didn't really go as well as it should have, it's likely because somebody wasn't made accountable in the right ways. And you can use this framework and frameworks like it to help correct it. It's at least worth a shot. Now, where I've seen a lot of teams have trouble with this is really in this first piece, right? It's really in the standards part. Next time you're in a meeting and you hear somebody, whether it's your boss or your manager or a colleague, kind of punt on defining standards by trying to finish up the conversation by saying something like, well, let's see how it turns out. Right, you can speak up. You can say something like, well, can we try to define that a little bit more specifically so that we know what we're all accountable for? Right, and little conversation cues like that can go a long way. You can still be respectful and respectable, but you still want to define those standards to help everybody out. And once everybody's on board with that idea, the next step is to create some commitments. And here's where boundaries comes back into play. Right? You want to create accountability, but without violating somebody's boundaries. So a great way to do that is to ask a closed-ended question, a question that ends in either yes or no. So as an example, can you finish the form submission piece by 5 p.m. today? Right, that's an easy way to make somebody accountable. And the other person can answer yes or no. Now, what if you're on the other end of this? What if this is your boss or your manager or your client coming to you and saying, can you finish the form submission by 5 p.m. today? Sometimes it's not always a comfortable spot to be in, especially if you are on the spot and you're not really prepared to have that answer. There are 2 obvious answers to this question, right? The first answer is yes. Does anybody want to take a guess as to what the second answer would be? The answer is no, right? So these are 2 acceptable answers to this question. But there's a third option that most people forget about, and it's probably one of the most powerful answers to this question. Does anybody want to guess what the third one is? Yeah. I don't know. That's a good guess, but that's not it, right? So the 2 most common guesses, right? Maybe is not a commitment, or I don't know. Those are not commitments either. Can you finish this form submission by 5 p.m. today? I don't know. Thanks for the help. It's not a commitment. So what can you do? Yes, no. If you can't answer one of those, or you won't answer one of those, which is okay too, the third option is you commit to commit. So what you can say is something like, it's 2 p.m. now, I'll tell you by 3. So I can't answer yes or no right now, but I will be able to soon, right? And this is really powerful because what is the person asking you actually looking for? They really just want to know what to expect. And you're letting them know that very soon they will know what to expect. What's great about this is that once you get good at answering both these three type of answers, right? You're probably good at yes and no already. But if you can get good at committing to commit, you can start mixing and matching these, right? So as an example, can you finish a form submission piece by 5 p.m. today? No, but I can get it to you by 6 p.m. Will that work for you? Right? This is good negotiation. This is good accountability. This is good boundaries. This is really powerful, right? It's more powerful because it's not just an interrogation about accountability. It's not one-sided. Now it's a conversation about accountability, right? Now both people are working to make each other accountable. Now let's take what we've learned so far and see if we can debunk one of the most used but toxic strategies. And it's this one. Under-promise, over-deliver. How many of you, it's okay, this is a safe space. How many of you have used this awful manipulative technique? Please stop. Please stop. Why do I hate it so much? Well, this has another name, right? This technique has another name that you may be familiar with, but maybe not associated here. The name for that is actually lying. Right? Let's look at how this works. I say to my client at 3 p.m., sorry, we're not going to have that new page up for today. The client's like, well, all right, yeah, I guess that's okay. Then at 5 p.m., here's that new page. The client's like, I thought we weren't getting that today. It's cool, I guess. Cool. What happened here? Above all, I think people just want to know what to expect, right? They want to know that your word means something, that when you say you'll do it, and when you say you aren't going to do it, that it's probably not going to get done. Now, there's nothing wrong with being wrong, right? So if at 3 p.m. you're like, I don't think I can get this done, and at 5 p.m. you realize, oh, actually it was easier than I thought, that's no problem, that's great. But own that fact, right? Don't celebrate finishing early like, oh, we over-delivered, before you apologize for actually setting the wrong expectations, right? That way your client will know that you value your word as much as they want to, right? If at 5 o'clock you go, hey, really sorry I told you earlier that this was not the case. I actually finished this earlier. I'm happy to give it to you if that's helpful, or happy to give it to you tomorrow as we discussed earlier, right? That gives them the option. It respects their boundaries. It says, I'm not going to encroach on you. You tell me what's good for you, and then I'll react in that way. Especially if any of you work in client services. As a service provider, that's part of what you should be delivering to your clients too, is that respect, that upholding of boundaries. One of my philosophies about doing client work, and this applies equally if your client is maybe a manager or another internal stakeholder, is I like to show clients the future. Right? That's the thing that I try to hold important in all my work. Let's let them know what's coming up at every turn. Right? So for every client, I set up what's called a project hub on a new subdomain, and it's just a simple list of all the upcoming milestones. Right? There's a more detailed project plan that they can dive into if they want to, but really just here's a list of everything that's coming up. On June 4, you'll see this, and on June 5, you'll see this, and 6 and 7 and 8, you'll see all this stuff, and this is all the stuff that we've completed. As we go on, it's okay if things shift, right? If one thing changes from June 4 to June 5, I'll let them know, hey, I think we need a little bit of extra time on that. I'll let them know 2 weeks in advance, right? So that they're like, all right, that's cool. And just so they know what to expect. We're always resetting those expectations. But it's important that the client always has kind of an accurate view of what the future could look like and what they can be confident in. And if this is interesting to you, it's open source, so feel free to use it and take it and remix it and do whatever you want with this. Now, one of the tough things about accountability is that you might run into someone who's like honestly just difficult to make accountable, right? Despite trying to establish standards or having measurements or having appropriate effects, nothing really seems to be working, right? Maybe some of you have worked with this person before. In that scenario, the chances are pretty high that you're dealing with an unmotivated colleague or maybe a direct report. And also, possibly, that person could be you. Right? Despite your best, you're trying to drum up the interest, but sometimes you just don't want to do it, right? I get that way too. I recently worked with a startup, and they asked me to coach their teams to level up kind of their collaborative process. And in particular, they asked me, they said, the designer's work isn't exactly up to snuff with what we think they could be producing, so maybe you could just kind of check in with them and see what you could unearth. And one thing that's important about this scenario is that they don't have a head of design, so the head of engineering has really been kind of standing in as the head of design to get the designers moving and kind of giving them their assignments. So when I sat down and talked to the head of engineering, and I said, what do you think the root of the problem might be here? He said, listen, we have to ship this product, and we don't have a lot of time to explore. The designers just want to pontificate and do whatever they want. We have to execute. We got to ship this. So I've just been telling them what to do. When I spent time with the designers and I asked them what the root of the problem would be, they said, honestly, we're just taking orders, like a bunch of people telling us what to do, and we're just not sure which one to do, so we're just doing them as best we can. So how do you fix this scenario? There's this amazing book called Drive by Daniel Pink. Anybody read this book? Oh, it's fantastic. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. In it, he describes a framework for what drives people, right? What motivates them. And this is the framework to get your team's AMP, to get them amped. Right? The first piece of this framework is autonomy. That's one of the first things that drives people. Right? The desire to direct our own lives is something that motivates people. Right? If I have control of it, then maybe I'm motivated. I'm driven to do that thing. The second thing is mastery. Right? It's the urge to make progress and get better at something that actually matters. Right? That drives people too. The last thing is purpose. Right? So the purpose is the yearning to do what we do in service of something larger than ourselves. And chances are, if you're working at a job where you have all three of these things, autonomy, mastery, and purpose, you're probably pretty driven and pretty motivated. And the opposite is actually true too. If you're working at a job that has none of these, you're likely unmotivated to do what you want. The designers at this company that I was helping, they had none of these three. So it wasn't surprising that they didn't feel driven or motivated. Everybody was telling them what to design, so they had no autonomy, right? They couldn't direct their own lives, or at least their own jobs. They were being managed by someone who didn't know their skills or even have a experience in that skill set. So that person had little idea for how to make progress with them. And the startup that I was working with, they're in financial services, and this category specifically, those two designers didn't actually have much interest in. Like for them, it was just kind of a paycheck. So purpose was not a box that was checked either. So what do we do? Well, we tried to carve out some space for them to practice at least one of these. So what we did was had the designers do a 2-week sprint that was just like everything that's on your roadmap, get through as much of that as you can, and then deliver that to the engineers, and the engineers have their hands full for the next couple of weeks. Now that the designers had some free time, we looked for kind of these autonomous spaces where it's like, where can you just flex a little bit? One of the designers is a good illustrator, and no one knew that. And so he's like, I'd really love to explore how illustration could kind of get into this financial product, which is kind of a weird concept and atypical for that space. But he's like, I just kind of want to explore that. So for the next 2 weeks, he spent time compiling material, reference material, sketching, and really just having a lot of fun. The other designer wanted to tighten up their not-so-used component library. And so she updated that with code samples and guidelines, and she kind of went to town on that. And what everybody started to notice was that these designers started to get more driven because they had these spaces of autonomy that really didn't affect too much, but they had these places where they can kind of do whatever they wanted. They had their own domain. A few weeks later, the team is kind of a well-oiled machine. It's not to say that they don't have problems, right? They're still kind of working through some of that stuff, but the designers are at least more motivated to be able to work and collaborate better. Now, so far, everything we've talked about was really about covering your own butt, right? Accountability, making commitments, all of that is foundational material to create a culture of work where everybody's boundaries are respected. But that's the stuff that just makes teams functional, right? It's not the stuff that makes teams great. My friend Aaron Walter, he's the VP of Design Education for Envision. He likes to say, nobody settles for a meal that's just edible, right? You're not like, well, that was so edible. It's like, you want your meals to be delicious. You want them to be great. And same thing with your teams, right? You're not like, well, that was very functional, right? You want to have fun, and you want to be able to be driven in what you're doing. Right, when we talk about teams where, on the left end of the spectrum, where everybody is selfish, right, that's the makings for dysfunction. I think we all know that, right? We try to avoid that. Don't be selfish on your teams. Don't work with selfish people. If you do, that's a toxic environment. You might want to think about getting out, right? But a lot of us don't work in that environment. At least I hope that we don't. But most of us work in environments kind of like this, right, where people are more self-centered, and it's not malicious, right? It's just everybody's kind of looking out for themselves, because if I don't look out for me, who is going to look out for me? But I think one thing we have to do in our industry is we have to push our teams further, right, in order to create that psychological safety that we talked about in the beginning. Team members need to be looking out for each other more. Simon Sinek is probably best known for his TED Talks and his book Start With Why, but this is my favorite of his books, Leaders Eat Last. Have anybody read this one? Oh man, this one is so good. It gives so many great tips and examples for how teams can be better supporting each other. Right, so in the book, he tells the story of an employee at a manufacturing company, Barry Wemiller, whose diabetic wife needed surgery. And this employee couldn't afford to lose pay. He couldn't afford to stop working, so he wasn't really sure what to do. And so a bunch of fellow employees got together, and they actually transferred their own paid vacation days to this man so that he could have paid time off. The company had never done anything like that before. No one had ever come up with that idea, and it was actually in violation of their HR policies. But it was such a powerful gesture that the company decided to make it happen anyway. I think it's just a really touching tale of how people band together to reduce each other's risk. There's also the story that he shares in this book of a tech company called NextJump, and they instituted a lifetime employment policy. And what that meant was, once you get hired, you can never be fired, unless, of course, unless you undermine your colleagues or you do something illegal, right? So there are a couple of stipulations, but other than that, you have a job here for life until you decide that you don't want it. If you perform poorly, you don't get fired. You actually get coaching. Right, the CEO, Charlie Kim, he thinks of taking care of his employees kind of like raising kids. He says most people would never get rid of their kids in hard times, right? So how can we lay off people under the same conditions? Here's a simple illustration of how organizations currently work, but how could they be so much more? Let's watch this video. Video. Psychological safety doesn't come from knowing that everyone will just do their jobs. It actually comes from knowing that when you're in a pinch, that somebody might help you with yours. And the best way to increase the chances of that happening is to be the first, is to be the example, to do that for someone else. Here's my last tip as we close up. When you get back to work on Monday, go around to each member of your team and ask them what you can do for them today. Respectfully, respect their boundaries, but don't take no for an answer. It could be work-related, like you convert a database, or you name all the layers in your sketch file. Or it could be as small as just making sure that somebody has a fresh glass of water every hour. This is the kind of stuff that I think makes our workplaces, not only our workplaces good, but our neighborhoods, our cities, our countries. I think this is the stuff that you're not going to pick up at a coding boot camp or a GitHub repo, but I think it makes all the difference. Thank you so much for listening. I hope that these tips were a good start for you to think about how to be good. Thank you. I think we've got a few minutes left here, so if anybody has any questions, happy to fire away.
If anybody has questions for Dan, I can run the mic around. If not, I actually have a question. So I, when you were talking about, initially you were talking about kind of setting boundaries and talking about different ways to kind of ask things like, can you do this by this time? And being very direct with the ask. I've found that it doesn't translate super well a lot of the time in written communication. Do you have any kind of advice on like being direct without having it be interpreted as terse or?
Yes. Yeah, it's a great question, and that's one that I get often when it comes to this topic. So a couple of things. One is that when I send emails and when I post on Slack, it is riddled with exclamation marks and emoji and smiley faces and all that stuff. And the reason is because, I forget where I read this, but when people read something that is dry, something that is neutral, when they read it, they actually interpret it 1 or 2 notches more negative. So you have to overcompensate for that, right? So you have to be over-emotive in written communication to be able to get to the point where it feels neutral. That's one thing to try, is like be over-emotive in your written communication in a way that you might not need to be because of context clues in real life. So that's one part. The other part that I think maybe is more important is that communication always has a context with it, right? So the context is if I don't know you and I say, hey, what are you doing? And if I'm a stranger, you're going to take that really differently than if we're old friends and I say, what are you doing? Even if the tone is the same thing. So all of our communication has history behind it, and or sometimes doesn't. One thing that I suggest with teams is eat together. Like, I've solved so many team problems over lunch because, and especially when you buy somebody lunch, because it's proof that you care for them. And if your question comes in the context of care, it's interpreted very differently than if it's an interrogation or if if kind of like in the talk, if they don't feel like they're psychologically safe. If you're asking them, can you do this by 5 p.m., the subtext could be, if you don't, you're going to get fired, right? People are worried about that. They have risk. So if you can alleviate that risk by saying, listen, I got your back if you don't. Sometimes you have to be over-emotive even when you say it in person. So if you say, hey, can you do this by 5 p.m.? By the way, it's cool if you don't. I just really would love that. You know, if not, let me know what you can do. Right? So you kind of have to extend a little bit more to be able to set the context for this person to say, you are safe here. This is a safe environment. Nothing bad will happen to you if, you know, the negative consequences of this will not affect you so much. And I think if you can create the context of that safe environment, then you build up the history of every time I ask you something, even if you don't do it well, no negative consequence, then that starts to build up the trust in people. Yeah.
When dealing with like the times of giving someone like a time to do something or responding to someone as when you can get it done, many times you're dealing with like unknowns. So for example, well, I can get this done, but it's really going to depend on this the graphics team getting me something, or it's really going to depend on this, or it's going to depend on like, I'm not sure if I can find the solution to this.
Yeah.
Or find the plugin, or I'm not sure if I really know how to do this. How do you answer that? In like, because that's the case when you want to say, I could, if everything falls into place, I can get this done by the end of the day, but if it doesn't, then it's going to take 3 days. But how do you answer that? How do you tell your boss that? Say, it depends, or maybe.
Yeah.
That's what you want to say.
It's a good question, and I think that the way that you answered is really great, right? Which is, you committed to commit. There are conditions with my answer. If I can find the plugin, then I can have it by this time. If I get the source files, then I can do this. If this, then that. That's a way to commit to commit. If I have this, then I can do that thing. What most people do, right, so I'll give you kind of the two sides of this, right, from the person who's asking and also from if you're in that spot answering. So your manager comes to you and says, when can you have this done by? Or says, can you have this done by 5 p.m.? Commit to commit says, if I can get these files by 2 p.m., yeah, I can have it done by 5 p.m. If not, then I can have it done 6 hours later than whenever you give it to me, right? If the answer is truly, I don't know, then you could fall back on commit to commit. I'm not sure right now. I need to do some research into this plugin. I need 3 hours to do that. In 3 hours, I'll have a better answer, right? And that could be an extended amount of time. That could be in 3 days, I'll have an answer, right? And so I think committing to commit is something that is a tool to use. Now, one thing that is kind of the subtext there is the two parties have to be able to trust each other. So if, as a manager, I say, can you get this done by 5 p.m.? And you go, no, because I need to do 3 days of research. And I don't trust that answer. There's a deeper problem to be solved there, which is that you and I need to figure out how we work together. So as on the manager side of that, I need to sit down with you and say, you know, maybe pull you into an office or have a private conversation with you, say, you know, I say that to say, having this conversation in public in front of a lot of people exacerbates that. So kind of having that conversation in private is more helpful. So what I would do is I would pull that person in the room and say, you know, I don't think that this would take three hours or 3 days. Can you help me understand why this would take 3 days? Because there could be something that I'm missing. So I guess part of the subtext of that is that both parties need to have trust, and also both parties need to be open-minded. So let me summarize that. This is kind of a long way of saying that. If your manager comes to you and says, when can you have this done, and there's a little bit of an unknown in there, you can state the condition. The condition is, if I do this, then I can do this, right? If I have research or if I have files. On the other side of it, if you are the manager, one thing that you can do is you can create that condition for people. Can you have this done by this time? If not, let me know what you need in order to be able to do that. Right? So you can again create that safe space, and that starts to get to that dialogue where you're building upon trust. I hope that's helpful.
All right, I think we have time for one more.
So I like how all of these things apply to yourself and internal teams, and I feel a lot of trust in things within my team, but one thing that we're kind of still working on is how to apply boundaries and these concepts to our team working with other teams. So maybe you can talk a little bit about extending that out to your group working with another group.
Yeah, can you give me an example, even if it's not specific? But
yeah, just around like deadlines and boundaries, and maybe our sprints don't sync up, or like I'm waiting on this thing from design and I made a request and they weren't sure that they could get it. I assumed they could get it done this sprint and they couldn't, and kind of this back and forth.
Yeah, it's a tough question to answer. I think that lots of people are uncomfortable saying no. Right? And a lot of about boundaries is what you let in and what you let in and what you keep out. If another team is encroaching on your boundaries by saying, you have to have this done by 2 p.m., right? And you're like, it's 1:30, right? Like, I don't even know you. Who are you? They're encroaching on your boundaries, right? They're potentially coming into your house without your permission. And when people do that, right, think about a break-in. I don't want to fight anybody. If somebody breaks into my house, I will fight them. Because when someone has encroached on your boundary, sometimes the only recourse that you have is to push them back, push them out of your house. And when people ask for things that are unreasonable, it's a little bit of a version of them doing that to you. Hey, I need this done by this time. Nope. Happy to talk about it if you want. I can have it, or if you want to extend your hand to that, then you can say, can't do it by 2, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I can do it by 5, if that's all right. Happy to tell you why it's going to take 3 hours. Happy to have that conversation with you. And so part of it is you establishing your own boundaries and being able to say, no, this is not a thing that I can do. Sometimes the capacity to say no is tougher, right? Sometimes there are consequences to saying no, and that's a thing that you'd have to evaluate. Like, is it worth me saying no, or is it worth letting people in? So one of the things about boundaries is that you get to choose who you let encroach on your boundaries. I let my wife encroach on my boundaries a lot. I let my kids encroach on my boundaries a lot. I let my friends encroach on my boundaries some. I let strangers encroach on my boundaries none. Right? And so being flexible about those boundaries extends to other teams. Right? You'll do more things for your team than you will do for another team. That's okay. That's great. Right? That's what you're supposed to be doing. So it's totally okay if some team says, you got to get this to us by the end of the day. You can go, nope, I'm not going to do that. And happy to talk about it if you want. Right? Like I said, there's probably some ramifications of that, but I think those are battles worth fighting. Thank you so much, everybody.